Welcome to this session on resilience and response during this GRV Global Forum for Action for Disaster Relief in Africa. In this session, we will revisit the concepts of disaster risk reduction and resilience and how we are applying them. Understanding that the disaster profile for Africa keeps changing, but we also want to interrogate a little bit more the opportunities that the continent has to offer to change the doom and gloom picture out there. I'm sure most of you who are on social media are watching the news. None of us can really avoid that these days, are seeing the constant images of flooding, food insecurity, the COVID pandemic and how it's impacting communities. What we're witnessing the last 10 to 15 years, or perhaps even longer, is that sadly, for many communities, they suffer repeatedly with little time to recover, let alone prepare to respond to disasters when they strike over and over again. The panelists today will discuss enhancing interagency cooperation and coordination across the continent with regards to flexible and inclusive approaches for building resilience. That word again, resilience. How much are we empowering communities by considering local knowledge, the rights of people and their culture, the youth and women-led grassroots initiatives to influence development post-disasters? My name is Tandy, and thank you to the online audience for joining us. Please, for the online audience, do use the chat options to send us your questions, leave us your thoughts and suggestions, and feel free to interrogate what the panelists are going to speak about today. Let's challenge ourselves to think beyond the traditional norms in how we are addressing disasters on the continent. I'm very privileged to have such a high-thinking, powerful panel of speakers today. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. I mean, you will see their bios online, so go there and just look through and read through enough to understand a little bit more about what our panelists do and also their profiles beyond what they are presenting today. Let me start with the one lady that we have on board today to introduce herself. Sibo, and she'll give her full names and functional title, is with the Southern African Development Community Secretariat. Sibo, welcome.
Thank you, Tandy, and thank you for having me in this panel. My name is Bongile Mavimbela, and I work for the SADC Secretariat. I'm heading the Environment and Climate Change Unit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sibo. Shall we go to Itonde Kakoma in Addis? Let's move from the south right up north to Addis.
Thank you, Itonde. Thank you very much. Itonde Kakoma, I serve as the permanent representative of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to the African Union based here in Addis Ababa. Thank you very much, Tandy.
Thank you, Itonde, welcome. Joseph, shall we hear who you are?
Thank you, Tandy, and good day to all our online participants and viewers. My name is Joseph Kamara. I'm the Regional Director for Humanitarian and Emergency Affairs for World Vision International. I look after East Africa region based in Nairobi.
Thank you, Joseph. Welcome to Nairobi. Welcome from Nairobi. I want to maybe stick around the East Africa region and speak to Sean. Sean, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Sean Granville Ross. I'm the Regional Director for Mercy Corps for Africa as the region. I'm also Joseph's neighbor based in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you.
Excellent. A powerful delegation in Nairobi. Where is Mare joining us from? Mare is with the World Bank, with the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction. I will take the pleasure of introducing you. I'm not sure where you're seated though, but hopefully during the conversation, you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about where you're seated and also the profile that you're leading at the World Bank. So let's get into it. Itonde, you are going to set the scene for us and perhaps help us understand what the disaster profile for Africa looks like. Like I said in my opening remarks, we keep seeing these crazy images, I call them. Tell us a little bit more from the IFRC perspective, what the disaster profile for Africa looks like. And perhaps while you're looking at the disaster profiles in Africa, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about the opportunities that Africa has to offer while we're battling with so much on the continent.
Thank you, Tunde. Well, as you rightly stated in your introduction, Africa is exposed to a compounding set of risks, impacts of climate change, the frequency of droughts, floods, and the environmental crisis more broadly, particularly with regards to land degradation, deforestation, and pollution, coupled by increased forced migration, displacements, food insecurity, health epidemics, not least of which being COVID-19, still the recurrent Ebola outbreaks, malaria, malnutrition, and these are associated with eroding social and health indicators. Now, in particular, climate change. The IFRC, together with the African Union Commission, recently launched the World Disaster Report 2020, which highlighted how the impacts of climate change are devastating lives and livelihoods every year, and how they are likely to get worse if climate action is not strengthened. And like you and colleagues online, the outcomes of the G7 summit, as we saw, reinforced the need to step up action on climate change alongside the global efforts to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, not in isolation of these persistent long-term challenges facing the continent. And here, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies will continue to work with countries throughout the world to ensure that we are translating these commitments into real action where it matters most, namely in communities most exposed to climate risks and also facing the economic fallouts from COVID-19. Now, in Africa, climate change is also impacting small-scale farmers and pastoralists who have experienced severe consecutive flooding and dry seasons that have impacted their lives and livelihoods. In 2020 alone, Tanvi, 11 African countries, as we know, had been highly impacted by floods, a factor attributed to the lack of readiness, preparedness to respond to these challenges, requiring great not only financial, but non-financial support to respond to these situations. Further to this, Tande, over 100 million people in Africa face catastrophic food insecurity levels. And these, according to estimates we have received through an integrated food insecurity phase classification. And the last 5 years, the Sahel and Southern Africa have been severely affected by droughts and floods impacting food security. Further to this, to make it even more complex, the unprecedented locust outbreak in the Horn of Africa put additional pressure on the regional food systems as we know it. And here, conflict and political instability further heightening this risk. That said, and as you rightly pointed out, the African continent presents numerous opportunities, especially as it pertains to the broad base and rapid development of the youth population, estimated at 60% overall of the population. And here also the abundance of natural resources, technology exploration, and the existence of policy and laws on disaster risk management that are being strengthened by the day. Equally so, and I'm keen to hear from colleagues working in the banking sector, increased public-private partnerships also as a great opportunity for more robust ways of responding to a number of these complex risks facing the continent. So to the COVID-19 recovery, if we can call it this, is an opportunity really to influence a more integrated response between various sectors. As the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, we really pride ourselves on the strength of the movement as rooted in national societies. And in all the countries throughout the continent where we work, we estimate approximately 2 million powerful volunteers, 1.9 to be more precise, anchored in local communities and at the front line of disaster preparedness and response. National societies have a privileged auxiliary role to their governments in responding to crises facing their respective states. And this is directly in line with the global commitments on increased localization and prioritization of a more robust responsiveness at the national levels. And here, the hands-on community experience of national societies, of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, provides an opportunity to really link local realities to regional and global ambitions on humanitarian and development action. Thank you, Tande. I'm keen to hear perspectives from other colleagues on the panel.
Thank you, Itonde. A lot of staggering figures that you give us there. 100 million people at the risk of facing acute food insecurity. 11 countries simultaneously were responding to flood last year, while still responding to the COVID crisis. And also the opportunities. I get excited at the discussion on opportunities, because really, I think the narrative around Africa's disaster response and profile really needs to change in terms of how we're all collaboratively working together to address these complex risks, as you put them, Itonde. Let me move to World Vision with Joseph Kamara, who, as you all heard, is a Regional Humanitarian and Emergency Affairs Director for East Africa. Joseph, having heard what Itonde describes Africa presents in terms of challenges and opportunities, and the session obviously being focused on resilience and response, I wanted you to take us back to the very basics and help us unpack in practical terms what the difference is between resilience and disaster risk reduction. Are they not the same?
Thank you, Tandy, and excited to hear my previous panelists unpack the African picture, the bigger African picture for us on disasters, and laying the foundation for us to discuss resilience and disaster risk reduction. And I would like to take you through my understanding and as well what we do in World Vision and how that relates with the subject matter, specifically about resilience. What I found interesting over time is that there has been a little bit of limited understanding of resilience among practitioners, especially within the humanitarian and development organizations and governments. And as such, we have tended to do many different things and all being lumped up into resilience. But the reality is that because of the limited understanding, we are not able to focus very well and make sure that we attempt or at least address resilience as we would like it to be. And as such, we always keep talking about resilience all the time and never seem to get it. It's always seemed to be elusive. But what my over learned is that there is a difference between resilience and disaster risk reduction. However, the two work in complementarity. They complement one another. Resilience is usually one's ability to bounce back, to go through, recover from a period of disaster. And disaster risk reduction are the interventions that we are able to marshal together, either one intervention or another, or a confluence of many, to ensure that we overcome or go through a disaster and recover from it. So there are various stages, and the two, as I said, complement one another. But what is more interesting is that for resilience to take place, we've got to look at it at different levels. We've got to look at a personal level, as an individual, at a household level, at a community level, at a broader society level, where we're able to reflect and say, yeah, that society is resilient. That society went through a particular situation and overcame it and can be said to be resilient. Now, the other interesting aspect is that resilience is actually context specific. In our experience in World Vision, we have been chasing resilience all the time. And sometimes we learn from one society, one region, and then go to another region and think it is the same. But over time, we have found that actually it is not the same because there are differences in context, differences in culture, differences in the practices, differences in the economy, in governance, all are different. And even the hazards are different. So resilience has to be context specific, has to be hazard specific. You may be resilient to drought in Southern Africa, but you may not be resilient to floods, or you may be resilient to many other of these hazards because experience has taught you to go through those. But you may not be resilient to a hazard like COVID-19 that has put us all on our knees, including the big economies that have always done well. We've seen that they are all vulnerable. So at one time or the other, we are all vulnerable. And at one time or the other, over time, we develop resilience. But the interesting part is that if we are able to develop resilience, if we put together different interventions and let those be backed up by the appropriate policies, policy plays a critical role, especially policies that are geared towards poverty reduction. If you have poverty or you have more poor people, you're going to have people who are very vulnerable. This makes the difference between us in Africa and in many other regions. For example, if you look at how countries in the Americas, for example, or Australia are able to recover from hazards or disasters, they recover quicker. Why? Because they have strong economies and the people are not that poor. So if you have appropriate policies that are pro-poor, that target the poor, that lift up the people from poverty, then you are likely to create resilient societies. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joseph. That really hopefully also does a lot of clarity for our listeners online, for the panelists as well. So as we go forward to discuss again where we stand as Africa on the whole resilience implementation in the different hazards, again, like you say, and that we know what we're doing. Quite interesting facts that you lay out in terms of how the humanitarian and development sector have all understood resilience differently. Hence, we're all doing everything and sometimes nothing and lumping it all under resilience. Important fact that you articulate well on poverty reduction and policies and how that is critical for resilience building and how governments get prepared because of addressing poverty as one of the key ingredients of building resilience. And talking of ingredients, I will turn to Sean Graville-Ross, the Regional Director for Africa at Mercy Corps, to talk to us about what the key ingredients that you spoke about, Joseph, mean when we're talking about building resilience in places that are particularly vulnerable to repeated cyclical disasters. What does resilience look like when you're trying to address needs in contexts that are facing protracted humanitarian needs? Sean.
Great, thank you, Andy. So, I think from our perspective, obviously the question we often ask ourselves is, how can development assistance be designed and delivered to reduce the humanitarian needs and advance the long-term goals, despite the recurrent sudden shocks and or the recurrent crisis that we see across much of the continent. So for us, certainly building from Joseph's comments, really the focus on resilience, as we think about that, it's sort of how do we build the capacity or the abilities of the communities and the people to advance and protect their well-being despite the shocks and stresses that you may see at the individual, the household, the community, or the institutional level. I mean, I think again, just, we're full of facts and figures across the panel, but obviously, between 2005 and 2017, the number of crises receiving an internationally funded appeal nearly doubled from 16 to 30. We know that the average humanitarian crisis now lasts more than 9 years, and nearly 3/4 of people targeted to receive assistance. that are in countries affected by humanitarian crisis for 7 years or more. And we also recognize that crises are increasingly more complex. These places are characterized by violent conflict, threats of climate change, and as the opening sort of panel member suggested, persistent food insecurity. So again, from a Mercy Corps perspective and from our work in the region, we ask ourselves the question of how can foreign assistance be designed and delivered to reduce future humanitarian needs and advance long-term development goals in the context of that are facing protracted and complex crises. I mean, if you think about typical shocks and stresses, they generally have a start and an end. Typically, they're limited to 1 or 2, and we probably have a clearer path to recovery and development. It's often possible to anticipate, and we can work on measures of preparedness or adaptation measures, some of that DRR. When we think about shocks and stresses in these protracted and complex crises, we know there's a start, but we wonder whether there is an end. There seem to be continuous shocks and multiple shocks. There is no linear pathway to recovery or long-term goals, and it's difficult to anticipate some of the shocks and plans. So as we think about building resilience, and obviously everybody has that clear framework of what we mean by resilience, but as we think about building resilience in protracted crisis, really means building the capacities to better cope with and adapt to the existing shocks and stresses. In other words, life is bad, but let's do what we can to deal with it as best as we can. Anticipate and prevent the future threats. Life is bad, but let's not make it any worse. And transforming the underlying drivers, including the root causes. Life is bad, let's make it better. So in the Mercy Corps sort of frameworks, as we think about building resilience, we really try to start to think about sort of the 3 interlocking processes of meeting immediate needs, thinking about the anticipation and prevention, and transforming the drivers of the crisis or the protracted context. So, you know, we need to be able to have rapid real-time analysis of the risk factors that drive and perpetuate crisis. We need to provide support to local market and the social systems to strengthen the sources of resilience. And we need to think about how we incorporate short-term violence prevention paired with efforts to transform the structural drivers of conflict. So, you know, as we think about this question of moving from relief to resilience, how do we support to local systems to strengthen the sources of resilience? That's really thinking about the market systems, the social systems, and the social connections or the governance. And also within that, obviously, this idea of short-term violence prevention paired with efforts to transform structural drivers of conflict. That's really the underlying work around peace building, dispute resolution, and the governance. That may not necessarily be the bigger drivers, but to think about the short-term disputes, be that over land, over access to natural resources, or even more imminent or immediate is the ability to think about the dispute resolution and the criteria around the selection and identification of program beneficiaries or participants. So I think as we think about building resilience in protracted crisis and trying to think about the move from relief to long-term resilience, for us in Mercy Corps, it's really thinking about, yes, meeting immediate humanitarian needs, and that may be with partners such as World Vision or the Red Cross or other organizations, but then moving towards the longer term development requires us to start to think about markets and the markets in those crises, coupled with this important aspect of understanding how you may integrate peace building in its various forms and sort of dispute resolution and the governance aspects within these sort of protracted and complex spaces.
Thank you, Sean. Really, really insightful and impactful. I will literally just speak on some key words to sort of provoke and sort of make a mental picture of what you're speaking about. You speak about strengthening local systems, you speak about disaster response, you emphasize markets and access to markets, you emphasize peace building, conflict management, you speak about partners, you also speak about connecting relief to development, and you come back and re-emphasize the issue of anticipating future risks and being able to prepare to respond to those. That is a lot that not one organization can do on their own. Let me move to the SADC region with Sibo. Sibo, you are going to take us a little bit deeper into something more programmatic, the Great Green Wall Initiative. It is said to be one of the best wonders of the world in restoring land. I'm quoting the president of Malawi, Dr. Lazarus Chakwera, who says that the Great Green Wall African Initiative is working wonders in restoring land. This Great Wall aims to transform the lives of millions of people by improving food security, resilience to climate change, and job availability while decreasing drought, famine, and migration. The Great Green Wall is also thought by many to be very focused for the Sahel region. And now we're seeing it expand to the SADC region. Can you maybe take us a little bit deeper into understanding what the Great Green Wall initiatives mean for the SADC region? I understand the ministers have met, they've approved the concept. What does it look like now, and what does it mean for resilience building?
Thank you, Tandy. You already said half of what I was going to say. But yes, the Great Green Wall, let me just give a bit of a background. In the SADC region, we have the Sub-Regional Action Program to Combat Desertification, which we call the SRAP under the UNCCD portfolio. And that was approved by our Ministers of Environment and Natural Resources in 2015. And the SRAP was developed to respond to the challenges of desertification, land degradation, and drought in the region. Now, as part of implementation of the SRAP, the SADC ministers also approved the Great Green Wall for the SADC region. So for us, it's an implementation program of our SRAP. Now, the Great Green Wall is meant to respond to the three Rio Conventions and addresses the challenges of desertification, climate change, and biodiversity loss, which the SADC region is very, very vulnerable to. The Great Green Wall Initiative is not solely aimed at creating a forest across the region, despite being strongly focused on increasing vegetative cover. It mainly comprises a set of integrated actions addressing the multi-sectoral problems affecting the lives of people in the drylands and semi-arid zones of our region. These multi-sectoral and multi-dimensional actions address a wide range of concerns, including drought management, which is very prominent in Botswana, Namibia, Angola, South Africa. It also enhances natural resource management, sustainability of rural productive systems, thereby addressing food insecurity in the region. The Great Green Wall SADC is also going to support ecosystems restoration programs in line with the needs of each country. Now, so far, what we have achieved is that we have received resources from the GIZ, or support from the GIZ, towards development of the GGWI National Action Plan for Botswana. Because for every country, we need to come up with a national action plan and outline the activities that we are going to implement under Great Green Wall. Now, the SADC Secretariat has also signed a technical cooperation program, a TCP, with the FAO Sub-Regional Office. And the purpose is to offer catalytic resources for further mobilization of resources and technical assistance for the initial steps towards coordinated actions for implementation of the Great Green Wall in the Southern African region. We're also finalizing work plans so that we can monitor the implementation and track our progress in all the activities that will be taking place in the region. The TCP with the FAO will also support the 12 other SADC member states in developing their national action plans. And also then the remaining member states, which makes it 3, will be supported by the African Union Commission under the Great Green Wall Coordination Unit. I don't know if you want me to proceed, or I can leave the rest of the information to the next round. I'll be guided by you.
I think that's perfect in terms of giving us a framework of what the SADC region is doing to address the cyclical droughts and issues of land degradation and desertification. That is perfect. I like the idea that you present in terms of linking the Great Green Wall Initiative, not just to building a green wall, but linking that to livelihood support and better resource management in the Southern Cluster. Thank you for that, Sibo. We will hopefully come back quickly because I know you all have pressing commitments that you need to run to. So I hope we can get as much from you all before you jump off the call. Sean, I'll come back to you quickly so you give a quick reflection, because what you described was quite complex. And I want to hear a little bit about what you see as opportunities. Do we still have opportunities to collaborate at the level and the scale that you described in terms of the different issues and complexity of disasters on the continent? Are there missed opportunities we're looking at right now that we can capitalize on moving forward, especially after we've heard from Sibo on this great initiative that is aiming to not just restore land, but also support livelihoods?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, when you say are there opportunities, there are certainly opportunities. For us, when you think about building resilience and you think about disaster response, humanitarian response, right? I think that it's important to understand we need to work with civil society, we need to work with the communities, we need to work with the private sector, and we need to work with the public sector, right? That's government. And so I think that, you know, again, also, when you think about building resilience, we all understand the absorptive capacities, what they call the adaptive capacities, and the transformational capacities, right? And those also occur at different levels within the complexity of the systems thinking around building resilience and preparing people so that they won't be impacted as frequently by shocks and stresses. So I think that the opportunity certainly exists to partner with the UN, the government, the donors. There's certainly huge opportunities to partner with government and think about how government prepares their own resources to support communities to build resilience. And I think most importantly also the need to work with the donors as we think about what does building resilience look like and how long does that take. I think you have this inevitable tension where humanitarian response and meeting immediate needs is about spending resources quickly. I think that
we're working from home. We can hear
yes. Sorry.
We can hear a baby trying to support
Yes.
mommy, I think,
Yeah.
in this meeting.
Yeah, sorry.
It's
life, the new life.
It's life as we have come to know it, and we appreciate that you can still function under the circumstances. Please carry on.
Trying to build resilience to the best of our abilities. Our transformational capacity just failed there with the door opening. So anyway, what I was just sort of finishing point is that I think that where we see tension is that immediate humanitarian response is about spending resources and identifying resources that you can spend in a quick way to meet immediate needs, which we understand is important. But building resilience takes time. Building resilience and understanding the complexity of the systems and building resilience as we talk about at those different levels, the community, the household, or the household, the community, the government level, takes time. And so again, we have to partner with the relevant institutions to understand how you marry meeting immediate needs with building long-term resilience and moving towards development.
Excellent. Sounds very good. It very much, again, links to what Sibo from the SADC region Secretariat has just spoken about in terms of this long-term vision for the Great Green Wall Initiative, looking at land restoration, government-led policies, which Joseph had also spoken about right at the beginning, but also Itonde in his opening remarks. So thank you for that. Sean, again, I'm sort of sticking around the themes because you kind of went quite wide with what we're trying to address in the resilience conversations. And I want to come back to Itonde. Itonde, your profile shows such a strong background in conflict management. And I wanted to hear from you how you see the link between humanitarian action, peace building, and conflict management. How do we situate ourselves in these very complex issues? Trying to build the Great Green Wall Initiative, people are still fighting, there's conflict, there's tensions over natural resources. Where does conflict management come in as we aim to address immediate humanitarian needs?
Thank you, Tunde. You put your finger on it. In fact, my background is tied principally to matters of international peace and security and peace mediation, and coming to the field of humanitarian diplomacy and humanitarian action through the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. I am acutely aware of the distinctions between these fields, but also the interconnectedness of them. And here, the emphasis of multilateral partners and bilateral governments on better understanding and equipping us to really work on a triple nexus aspect becomes crucial. So taking seriously not solely development, not solely humanitarian, but also that of peace. And we heard our colleagues from Mercy Corps, World Vision, and SADC also point to the interconnectedness of these areas and more. In fact, this morning, in a bilateral conversation, a representative to the African Union said to me very plainly, she thinks of this along the lines of 3 C's, namely COVID-19 responsiveness, climate change responsiveness, and conflict responsiveness, all of them being absolutely fundamental and impossible to be viewed in isolation from one another. Even so, the long-standing, more than a century tradition of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement really underpins the importance of neutrality in humanitarian action, impartiality in humanitarian action, putting at the center humanity, as well as independence. So as much as we think about the interconnectedness of these sectors, we also will need to ensure that the quality of humanitarian action is preserved along those fundamental principles. In addition to those articulated, the real spirit of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is rooted in the voluntary service tied to local representation. And here, that unity of purpose across the movement and universality of these principles holds. So yes, interconnected, ever more complex crises that we are facing, whilst ensuring that the integrity of humanitarian action is preserved. I'd be happy to say more, Tunde, but I'm keen to hear from other colleagues in this respect as well.
I will not attempt to summarize what you just said, Itonde. I think the message was very loud and clear there, and I pick on the 3 C's and linking that to responsiveness, the triple nexus, and the strong partnership building that's required, and then how you anchor the way we should structure ourselves to work with humanitarian principles as a key consideration. Thank you so much for that insightful articulation on the connection between humanitarian action and peace building. Joseph, let me come back to you quickly, and then I'll hear some last thoughts from Sibo and Sean. Then I will continue talking to Itonde and Joseph before we hopefully go back and check if Mari can still join us. Joseph, after everything that you've heard on peace building, DRR, resilience, partnerships, community engagement, land restoration, desertification. Where does that sit in terms of looking at the output of resilience? Programmatic, project, please unpack it for us in very practical terms, how you see it going forward in terms of building lasting resilience.
Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button. Thank you. Yes, indeed, I concur with my colleagues, and this is what makes resilience quite interesting, because it can be very broad, it can be very abstract, but also at the same time, it can be very clear, depending on which lenses you put on. And with that, I would say, indeed, the difference, you cannot achieve resilience unless a society, a community, or a household, or even an individual cannot be resilient unless you have certain tenets that you sit on. I'll give an example. If, as an individual, if I have a household where my children have not gone to school, they are not educated, I am not educated, I have limited education, and have less understanding of causes of diseases and how to prevent diseases, and less understanding of the role of nutrition in well-being of the child for the rest of for the future of that child, I will not be resilient to any disturbance, any shock that occurs in the lifetime of my household. Probably I'll lose more children. They would either succumb to death, or many different things will happen that are inappropriate. As such, the same thing applies to a society. If you look at it from the community level, or at a society level, be it national or subnational, whichever approach you need, whichever level, you need a combination of interventions, and these must be anchored in appropriate policies. And thankfully, the international community has realized this long before, and we have had numerous frameworks that have been set for us where we can fall in as humanitarian and development agencies to implement, or to fall in and pursue creating resilient communities. For example, we've had the Hyogo framework, we've had the International Panel on Climate Change, we've had the Sendai framework, and now we have the SDGs. All these, if you look at them, each one of those talks about building resilience in a society and among people, in communities, and that means even among individuals. So when we come together as, for example, in World Vision, what we do is we have tried as much as possible to look at the broad long-term approaches towards working towards building resilience, and the short term. So we have short-term interventions, humanitarian interventions, where we respond to the actual need. People are in need, people are in crisis, they need help now. You cannot talk to them about the future. Therefore, we respond appropriately. But other than that, we have put in place structures where we try as much as possible to intervene in a community with interventions that last at most about 15 years. And within those 15 years, we aim as much as possible to try and make sure that the children we meet when we go into that community, by the time we leave at 15, have at least achieved certain level of education where they are able to read, to write, to count, but more so, they are prepared at least for the next phase of their life in society to be responsible citizens, but more so to move on to the next level of their education. And we believe that that gives them the foundation. Now, that is not sufficient at all. I wouldn't say that is sufficient, but that gives the foundation. And I believe other people come, other agencies and interventions, governments play a critical role and to build on that or to broaden the scope. But what is critical here is that you will not have just one intervention, one program or one project to build resilience. It must be building on a process that has been ongoing or that you'd like to start and make sure it continues, because resilience can be a process, but at the same time can be an outcome. And that outcome happens after a long-term process. When you look at some societies, for example, let's take a few years ago when we had Hurricane Katrina in the US. Now, US is such a giant economy. Everybody knows everything good, in terms of wealth, lies therein. But when Hurricane Katrina happened, we got to see another side of that society. We got to see the poverty there. And then the US realized, and we all realized, that actually they weren't prepared for that cyclone, the implications of the cyclone to that particular society. Now, that cyclone could have landed on a different part of the US, and maybe it may not have caused much hazard, because the people, probably the society, the different societies would be at different levels of wealth, different levels of preparedness. So, or maybe would have much more incomes to protect themselves, to help to enable themselves recover quicker than what we saw what happened. We may not be able to stop hazards, but what we can do is to be able to build on our abilities to recover from those hazards, to go through those hazards and recover quicker, and move on. And that's what resilience is about. So in a nutshell, I would say that a combination of multiple interventions anchored in appropriate policies would lead to resilient societies to a particular hazard, to a particular context. For example, in Southern Africa, you struggle a lot with droughts and floods. So the skills and the skill sets and requirements of responding or preventing or mitigating the impact of floods and drought are completely different. Even among communities, how they respond to both is completely different. So when you're working towards building resilience to those hazards, you have to think of those skills and requirements and effects and impacts, and what you exactly need to intervene in to make sure that that society, that community is, or you're contributing towards their resilience.
Thank you,
Joseph. I'm doing it for society.
Thank you, Joseph. We totally get your emphasis on just how diverse the partnerships have to go for us to achieve lasting resilience. And I am going to be looking forward to going to your website and searching for those good examples that World Vision has in some of the communities we've been working on. Sean and Sibo, I just want to hear your reflections from the discussions you've heard today from partners in terms of going forward. What are we doing wrong? Because something is obviously not working. Everything that's been said is fantastic. I think we're all on the right path of thinking. So what are we doing wrong? Because when I go on my Twitter, on the news, it doesn't look good. We don't seem to be talking to each other. We seem to be leaving the women out. And I actually am not happy with myself in this panel, because I would have loved to have the voices of young people be here and contribute to these conversations, because like Itonde said, it is the bulk of Africa's population at the moment. How do we actually bring them on board and make sure that we are harnessing the intelligence, the energy, and the innovation that they're coming with? So I want to hear your parting thoughts. Sibo, I'll start with you, Sean, because I know the urgency that you have with time. Tell me what we're doing wrong and how do we move forward?
So I don't think we're doing anything wrong. I think that we are increasingly recognizing the complexity of the context and the complexity of the content. I think that the changes in the climate are for real. People have finally realized that's for real. There's a huge sense of urgency around understanding the implications of that. And I think that you're right. Itonde set us up early on. Africa is a young continent. And so what is most important now is to think about how we intentionally target the future young African leader, wherever we may find them, and engage them. They're the future of Africa. The change in Africa has to be in the hands of the young African leaders that we can find, be that in the household, the community, the business, or the government. And that's where I think we'll start to make real headway as we continue to recognize that it's complex, and that complexity is going to require us to think about working in partnership with all of those key stakeholders and thinking long term, not just short term. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for that very positive reinforcement on the humanitarian and development community. We are increasingly recognizing the complexity of the issues we face and the focus on youth engagement. Thank you so much for those reflections. Sibo, how do we take ourselves forward, particularly with regard to implementing the Great Green Wall Initiative in the Southern Cluster?
Thank you, Thandi. Winston Churchill once said, never waste a good crisis. So I'm going to write on those words by saying there are opportunities that will emerge from what COVID-19 has taught us. GGWI can enhance a sustainable, resilient recovery after COVID-19. We need to avoid environmentally destructive investment patterns and activities. I hope my colleague from the World Bank can assist us on that note. The global crises such as climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, pandemics such as COVID-19 cause enormous social and economic damages. So we need to build back better by adopting economic packages that support resilience of both ecosystems and people, and adopt activities that reduce future shocks as well. The Great Green Wall is one program that is centered around well-being and inclusiveness. You've already said there should have been youth or women in this panel to bring in those dynamics. But the Great Green Wall is one area that encourages the shift towards long-term emission reduction goals, therefore factoring in resilience to climate and disaster impacts, slowing biodiversity loss, increasing land-based production and productivity, and in that way increasing food security. But we do have challenges. We do have challenges because the Great Green Wall is a long-term impact program, and therefore sustainability is key to its success. We need human resources. We need, for instance, in SADC, a dedicated unit that can take care of the program. We need financial resources. We need multi-country, multi-year financial support. We can't do it in piecemeals. We can't have fragmented small projects here and there and say we will achieve any impact. We need long-term investments into the program. So I am really upset that my colleague from the World Bank, maybe eventually, maybe he can hear us on this, but I really want to emphasize long-term, multi-country, multi-year investments into programs like the Great Green Wall. Then we will bounce back better. Thank you, Thandi.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sibo. Again, I will really not attempt to even summarize the issues you have so articulated well. And I do hope Mare has been listening in. I know you have to jump off. We will be in contact. I think we will all reconnect at a later date to make sure that we can sort of just rehash some of the issues we've discussed and then feed off each other's thinking as well going forward, particularly on issues that you raise: long-term investment, partnerships, the inclusion of young people and women in fostering lasting resilience. So thank you so much for your words, Sibo. We do hope to reconnect with you in the next coming week. I think Ian will guide us, but we want to thank you for having joined us today and looking much forward to connecting with you in a few days.
Thank you so much for having me, Thandi.
Thank you. I'll continue talking with the three gentlemen that are left with me. Let me turn back to Mare now. Mare, please tell us that you were able to follow the conversation, so that you can pick up something in terms of how you see us functioning. The aspect on partnerships was very strong from all the speakers.
Can you hear me now?
Yay!
Fantastic.
Yeah, finally. Thank you so much. I think my laptop didn't want to wake up at 4 a.m. for a meeting or a recording. But finally, we are resilient. We try to adapt, to accommodate, to find solution, and then to be in this important panel discussion. and bringing our perspective and response and resilience to disasters and shocks and crises in general. It's very important to have a good coordination and interagency cooperation partnerships when crisis happens in Africa or in anywhere in the world. At the World Bank, we have good internal coordination and cooperation from the global practice to the regional unit, but also the country management unit. But what is the most important and complicated was the interagency cooperation. And in general, what we used to have is we used to have duplicative and repetitive assessment from different stakeholders and partners when a disaster happens in some countries in the world. And to avoid this situation, we decided at the World Bank with UN and EU to sign a joint declaration on post-crisis assessment and recovery planning in 2008. And since then, we are jointly working for every kind of disaster. If we have a request from the government, then we work together to develop the assessment and the recovery planning. For now, we have jointly assessed 80 disasters in the world, from the earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia, the earthquake in Haiti, the recent cyclones in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, the tsunami in Samoa, the volcano in Cabo Verde, in many countries, and we have developed this joint assessment. And we have a methodology that is named the PDNA Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, and with 20 guidance and short guidance, sectoral guidance not developed. We developed together the recovery and peace building assessment for countries in fragile and conflict situation. And we have also developed what is called the disaster recovery framework to help countries organize themselves for resilient recovery. And recently, when the COVID-19 happened in the world, we jointly developed what we call the COVID-19 Recovery Needs Assessment, or CRNAs, which is being implemented in different countries to assess the impact of the pandemic. Then we came up with a rigorous quantification of damage, of losses, and recovery needs, and also a clear narrative of non-quantifiable social and human effects and impact of disasters. And this is concluded with a recovery strategy, which will be developed later in a disaster recovery framework for medium and long-term resilience. We have built the capacity of more than 3,000 experts in the world, from government institutions, from civil society organizations, from private sector, local authorities, and international agencies. And we have also developed an online platform for training and certification of experts in these methodologies. We have a three-tier coordination between us with UNDP, World Bank, and EU. At HQ level, from DC, New York City, and Brussels, where the agencies have their headquarters, then we coordinate every time that a disaster happens in the world. But also at country level with the UN representative coordinator, the country management director of the World Bank, but also the EU delegation in the country. Then they also coordinate with clear distribution of roles and responsibilities. And finally, we have at strategic level what we call the SLAG, the Strategic Level Advisory Group, and also the High Level Advisory Group for decision making at the highest level. Then we cooperate on mobilizing resources and deploying experts for responding to disaster, and also to ensure there is a continuity, a continuum from humanitarian relief to response, recovery, resilience, and then sustainable development. And these methodologies are being regularly assessed and improved by adding more dimensions and flexibility. Then these methodologies are now being adapted and integrated into national legislation, policies, and strategies, but also we develop the local level guidance, and this can be used now at municipal or provincial level. Then this is a good model of cooperation, of coordination, of partnership between international agencies, and I think it helped a lot African countries and also many other countries in the world that are disaster prone.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Mario. We are very excited to have you back and hear the pearls of wisdom from the World Bank, particularly around the issues of partnership, which have come out quite strongly. And I hope the online audience, my panelists that are still here, and I know Sean and Sibo are also going to follow this conversation, and where there are questions, you heard Sibo really emphasize that aspect of partnering with long-term development partners in ensuring that the work that we're doing in disaster response and resilience tie together, because these sectors need to work together jointly. Thank you so much for that. I will now just have a few moments with all of you to just give me your parting thoughts. I want to hear how your organizations are reacting to disasters and resilience going forward. Itonde, what does it mean for the IFRC to take conversations on climate change and food insecurity going forward? What is the IFRC doing?
Thank you, Tande. Look, as our colleagues from the World Bank, World Vision, Mercy Corps, and SADC have clearly indicated, the current situation demands that all stakeholders should engage in urgent action at a community, national, regional, and continental levels, and really putting into action climate change strategies in that response. Here, what our colleague from the World Bank has clearly indicated, that technical and financial partnerships to take collective action to address adaptation. This becomes a means to enable a more robust African approach for collective action and to really adapt to the circumstances, especially in support of the most vulnerable populations, and of high importance to the Federation is that we must together prioritize the—
Itonde, you were at the point of talking to us about the robust partnerships that are required, both technical and financial, that are needed to advance work on resilience. Perhaps you can just take it from the top and guide us on the work of the IFRC and your thinking in taking the Federation's work forward in resilience building.
You summarized it extremely well, Tande, and here of high importance to the Federation is that we must prioritize populations most at risk and who are unable or least prepared to manage climate-related risks, and those facing climate threats really at the center of what we do. Equally so of high importance is utilizing available risk information for preparedness and to properly reevaluate our actions in progress regularly. Now, the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies is well positioned for some of the issues that have been outlined today, particularly at a grassroots level, to support communities to prepare, respond, and recover from disasters, hereby leveraging on the capacities to access even the most difficult to reach areas through a robust volunteer presence. Now, the IFRC is working on the belief that response cannot be the only option moving forward. Rather, it will be important to prioritize preparedness and disaster risk reduction actions and efforts equally. And as part of our mandate, the IFRC localization agenda in strengthening local preparedness, disaster reduction, and response capacities through this vast volunteer and resource mobilization through, for example, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society's Climate Center and Livelihoods Resource Center and Preparedness Center. More practically, or in a more focused way, in Africa, we have a set of flagship initiatives, and these include the Zero Hunger Initiative, where food security and livelihoods are put at the center. Equally so, the Pan-African tree planting and care, beautifully dovetailing with what our colleague from SADC described as a priority agenda in the Green Wall, the Great Green Wall Initiative. So too, the IFRC is contributing to that vision through Pan-African tree planting and care, and this being aligned with both continental, subcontinental, and national plans and strategies. And finally, again, hearkening back to that globally endorsed agenda on localization as the best and most sustainable means to respond to pressing crises, we emphasize the strengthening of local capacities through our national societies throughout the continent. Again, approximately 2 million strong humanitarian volunteers across the continent. Thank you, Tande, and thank you, colleagues. I look forward to continuing the conversation and working together.
Thank you, Itonde. I will move directly to Joseph for your parting words. Again, taking us forward, World Vision. How do we do this?
Thank you, Tande. Yeah, the good news is that it's not too late to make a difference. However, if we wait longer, it can get too late. In World Vision, we have been calling upon governments in different parts of the world to invest significantly in climate change and look at it differently. Now, climate change has been politicized at a very high level and made it creating people for and against. But we believe that by investing in research, we believe that by simple community-based innovations, we can make a difference and show people and show different actors that there are different ways that we can intervene in climate change without antagonizing each other, at the same time making a big difference. My colleagues, Tande and Itonde, have talked about regreening Africa, about the green wall, and Itonde has just talked about replanting trees, replanting across Africa. In World Vision, we have a similar intervention, and that's called the farmer-managed natural regeneration, where we are working with communities and helping these communities understand that if they leave their land to fallow a bit and then allow the shoots to come out of the ground, they can then identify those that will be trees and those that will be weeds. They can remove the weeds and start pruning the small little shoots that come in and nurture them as trees. And we've done this at a very, very minimal cost. We worked with Mayor, I don't know whether you're aware, we worked with you at the World Bank to develop one of the Africa's largest LULUCF based project in Ethiopia. It's basically working with the communities to regreen their community. And in that area where that happened, a place called Humbo in southern Ethiopia, it was a very highly eroded area where there was huge land degradation because of high population and because trees had been cut. Literally, it had, at one time when we were doing a PRA, people were telling us that God had cast the land and growing rocks. But when we talked to the community and worked with them to show them how they can, without necessarily planting trees, how they can let the roots underground that have not rotted to sprout up again, and then they start pruning, then they can even work with the intercrop, put in crops while the trees are growing and prune them and use the pruned twigs and branches for firewood and other resources. And that area rejuvenated significantly, as Maria may be able to tell you. It's one of the flagship projects. And we have these, recently I was talking to one of my seniors and he was saying, my regional boss in East Africa, he was saying, we need to stop the Sahara. Basically, that's just hypothetically, that's not necessarily the Sahara alone, because we have droughts and other hazards across the rest of Africa. But if we invest significantly in climate change, in stopping or mitigating climate change or adapting, then we can reduce the impact. So in my summary, I would say significant investment. We're calling up for significant investment in climate change adaptation and mitigation, we're calling for governments to look again at the current policies. Most of the countries across the region in Africa have very outdated policies that do not actually look at resilience. They mostly they are very reactive and not proactive in a way to position governments for the future in issues dealing with climate change. And that's a key issue that we need to look at, especially when we are dealing with disasters and disaster response, but not only that, but also poverty alleviation policies. So refocusing policies, investment in research, and investment in climate change are critical tenets that we think that will contribute significantly. Thank you, Tandy.
Thank you, Joseph. I will turn to Mare, our last but not the least speaker, to just give us your thoughts on reflections, even because you listened, you were our listener today, really, amongst the panelists. So your reflections in a few minutes. Mare.
Thank you, Sandy. I think this was very interesting discussion, and the World Bank is involved in all those dimensions, all those issues that the panelists was talking about, especially the issue of climate change, the issue of gender and development, the issue of human capital, community engagement, the issue of inclusion, but also the issue of preparedness and recovery and resilience to disaster. We have developed what we call when we are preparing for the COVID-19 response, building back better from the crisis toward a green, resilient, and inclusive future. And I think in this document from IDA 20, we developed many teams like what I mentioned previously: human capital, climate change, gender, fragility, also and conflict, but also jobs and economic transformation, and some cross-cutting issues like preparedness, governance, and debt and technology. And this is very critical for response and recovery, but also for resilience to disaster. And the World Bank is involved in these issues, supporting its clients, the countries, but also as international agencies and civil society organizations involved in these interventions on the ground. And we are mobilizing more and more funds to be distributed to regions, but also to countries that are disaster prone, and helping them to build a long-term and sustainable resilience to disaster.
Thank you, Mare. Thank you, Itonde, Joseph, Sibo, and Sean. I have been extremely excited to stand here and just listen to the power of the passion in your voices and the work that you're all doing and leading from your different organizations. I will attempt to summarize, and I'll give it a very, very short attempt. We started off really almost on a gloomy note, hearing about this very gloomy picture on the disaster profile for Africa. 100 million people face food insecurity, acute food insecurity even. Itonde mentioned 11 countries last year were simultaneously responding to floods while still addressing COVID-19 and the impact it's having, both economic, financial, and health, social as well in communities. Having understood that, we also moved to just revisit the concepts of resilience and disaster risk reduction, understanding what are we doing right? Are we just sort of maybe running in circles and not knowing what we're doing? But the clarity came through as we continued talking, understanding that yes, there are different organizations that are doing different work, and resilience requires that. It requires that partnership between different organizations and interventions to make sure that we are connecting the work in disaster response to longer term resilience building. There has been some provoking thoughts in terms of, do we not really have the full understanding of resilience and how we're applying that? Some conversations around, are we not doing enough? But also really positive thoughts around how the humanitarian and development community has moved to increasingly acknowledge the complex issues that we're facing as Africa, but also how we need to really strengthen the partnerships to ensure that everything starts to tie together. the aspect on peace building and conflict management, a critical component that has come out as well. And so understanding that the work we do in humanitarian action does not lie or stand alone from work that has to happen in investments in peace building and conflict management. COVID-19 has been highlighted as a key focus for rebuilding back better. How are we talking with partners like the World Bank, with private sector and our traditional donors to interrogate how some of the financing mechanisms are structured so that they are not short-term, but ensure that they are linking more strongly to longer-term investments. And of course, the emphasis on community engagement, the focus on the most vulnerable has to remain a priority. There's obviously so much more that has been said that I cannot really manage to go through, but I do hope our online participants have got questions and thoughts and even maybe disagree with some of the things that we have been talking about today. And they might offer us different pearls of wisdom that we might want to look at and decide, you know what, there's a point there from a young person seated in Zambia or Cameroon or in Mali, for that matter, that have solutions that we're not properly harnessing. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm looking forward to the question and answer session where we come back again together and again gain from each other's expertise. I wish you all a beautiful day. Thank you for the pearls of wisdom shared today. Have a good day.